This is all wrong. I shouldn't be up here. I should be back in school on the other side of the ocean. Yet you all come to us young people for hope. How dare you!
Boring. Boring. Boring.
Okay, you gotta work. Don't tell us what we're gonna feel. We're trying to solve a problem. Don't tell us what we're gonna feel.
I'm not telling you.
Because you're in no position to dictate that. That's exactly what you're doing. You're in no position to dictate what we're gonna feel.
I call again for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, the return of the sausages, the hostages.
Greetings, one and all. Lembedopik here on Lembedopik Live. There's a clue in the name. On Unprecedented TV. And if you are one of those wonderful people who've liked or subscribed to our station, then thank you very much. If you haven't, please do it. It helps us a lot. Costs you nothing, but it does make a big difference to us. So please go to at Unprecedented TV. That's at Unprecedented TV on YouTube. And like and subscribe, and you'll find hundreds and hundreds of shows all available absolutely free for your delectation, education, and information. Also, if you've got ideas for shows, let us know as well. We're in expansion mode at the moment. We'd love to know what you'd like to see us making. Now, let's talk about the forgotten war in Ukraine. Why do I say forgotten? People aren't really talking about it anymore, are they? They're more obsessed with Epstein and the war in the Labour Party in the United Kingdom, where it seems that Custer, a.k.a. Starmer, is making his last stand, while his troops say, we're right behind you, Keir. And apparently a standing ovation is enough of a reason to continue. Well, I would say they should be measuring on initiative, not applause. But that's just me. I'm not in the Labour Party. Big test coming up, of course, at the end of February. Last Thursday in February, there's a by-election in Manchester in the north of England, or just outside it, a place called Gorton and Denton. This is now a referendum on Keir Starmer. Let's just see how it goes. It's a safe Labour seat. If they lose it, I'm sure the finger of blame will be pointed at Keir Starmer, who could have had Andy Burnham as a successful candidate. Most people think he would have held that seat. But oh no, too much of a threat to Starmer's leadership. So he was booted out of the running for that. That's for another time, though. There'll be a lot of conversation on that. I want to talk about another war. It's the Ukraine war. That war which was going to be won by Zelensky with a little help, or a lot of help from America and his friends in Europe. America's not so keen. They can see Zelensky's a loser, in my opinion, and they've left it to Europe to sort it out. But that doesn't seem to be working very well either. So what's going on? Why aren't we hearing about the Ukraine war? Who's winning? Who's losing? And who's best to give us their opinion? None other than Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos, a truly informed, academic, and inspirational human being. Good to see you, Doctor. How are you?
I'm well, Lembit, and thank you as ever for having me on.
Well, it's always a pleasure to have you here. The big question is, why haven't we been hearing anything about this extraordinary lack of, well, frankly, lack of progress by Ukraine? Let's take a step back from that. What is going on in Ukraine at the moment?
As it currently stands, the Russian army is steadily advancing along the entire front line. Indeed, only recently I carried out some extensive research into the Russian military campaign in the oblasts of Sumy and Kharkov. And it is very interesting because there the Russian army is expanding its presence on a daily basis. Land in both Sumy and Kharkov is being captured by the Russians, which falls into line with what I have said for a long time now, that the Russians will not just make claims to Donetsk, Lugansk, Zaporozhye and Kherson. They will make claims to wherever the Russian army is. So now that the Russian army is in Sumy and Kharkov, as well as in Dnipropetrovsk, soon you will hear the Kremlin say that these oblasts belong to the Russian Federation.
And do they? in your opinion?
I have long said this, Lembit, and I can support this with empirically based evidence that, with the exception of the westernmost part of Ukraine, which historically is known as Eastern Galicia, it's comprised of Lvov, Ternopil, and Ivano-Frankivsk. The rest of Ukraine is part of Russia, historically and culturally. If you look at how the population of the Ukraine voted in the March 1991 referendum in the Soviet Union, over 70% of the population voted to stay a part of the USSR. The only part of the Ukraine which voted for independence was the aforementioned Eastern Galicia. So, for example, the oblast of Odessa, the oblast of Nikolaev, these are regions, these are cities which were established by the Russian Empire. And when it comes to Odessa, specifically Catherine the Great, no one seriously doubts that these regions are not part of Russia historically and culturally. Anyone who says otherwise is either ignorant or is simply paid to say that.
There'll be those who actually say that you haven't, in a way, got the authority to take that position because you're not there. You weren't there, man. They'll say that unless you've been on the ground, you won't be aware of the fact that there's a whole bunch of prisoners of a Russian occupation there. That there's a whole bunch of people who want to be liberated by Zelensky and his valiant army. What would you say to those who say that you're the propagandist?
Well, because I'm not in Ukraine, this doesn't disqualify me from commenting on it. Indeed, a Oxford or Cambridge scholar on ancient Greece, of course, cannot visit ancient Greece, but this does not mean that he or she is disqualified from commenting on ancient Greece. I have a PhD in Russian history. I am very, very familiar with the history of the Russian Empire, and before that, the Tsardom of Russia. I'm very familiar with the Soviet Union, and I'm very familiar with how the Soviet Union came to be no more. The Soviet Union did not collapse. The Soviet Union was dissolved. And in regard to allegations by Western mainstream journalists, for example, that people all over Ukraine are praying to be saved from the advancing Russian army. Well, where is the evidence of that? Where? Well, the Financial Times knows nothing about Russian history. The Daily Telegraph also knows nothing about Russian history. I have always said, in the westernmost part of Ukraine, yes, there is intense hatred of everything to do with Russia, because much of the population there has Austrian, Polish, and Lithuanian blood in it. Indeed, most of the population there are adherents to Catholicism, not to the Orthodox faith.
So let's look at the map of the situation, and this might not be absolutely up to date, but they're all quite similar to this. You've got Ukraine there, a lot of it, Kiev way to the west there, but you've got this whole band on the east side, much of it under the control of the Russians. Crimea went over a decade ago, and these other parts. Now, this is not surprising, in fairness to people who follow these things, because Vladimir Putin wants a buffer zone. NATO lied to the Soviet Union and then to Russia and said, oh, not 1 inch to the east, but they have. So now what I think Russia wants is its own buffer zone. It's grabbing it because NATO hasn't offered it. Are you saying that the darker colored part would be fairly happy to be part of Russia?
I am saying that from the Donbass to Odessa, from the Donbass to Kirovgrad, from Kirovgrad to Vinnytsia and Zhytomyr, and from there all the way to Kiev, The majority of the population there considers itself as Russian, historically, culturally, and linguistically. Again, in the March 1991 referendum, over 70% of the population of what was then the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic voted to remain a part of the USSR. Only in the westernmost part did the population vote to be independent from the Soviet Union. Ukraine, like Kazakhstan, like Belarus, are artificial countries. Their independence came about as a shock to the populations of Kazakhstan and Belarus and Ukraine. That's not Russian propaganda. That is factual. But alas, we live at a time in Britain and in the Western world in general, where if you have a different opinion on Russia and interpretations of Russian Soviet history, you are labeled as a Putin apologist, as a Russian propagandist. But of course, those people who are saying that are the propagandists themselves. They do not know anything about the former Soviet Union, but then they don't need to know anything about the former Soviet Union. Politicians, for example, in the House of Commons, mainstream journalists, for example, on BBC News, Sky News, Channel 4 News, The Guardian, The Telegraph, they're not paid to know about Russia and Ukraine and Belarus and so on. No, they are paid to peddle disinformation because those journalists are neither free nor independent. They are part of the British ruling elite, and they are, of course, useful idiots.
No, yes. Well, we might mention some of them in a little while. I don't want to go too far down the travails of Keir Starmer today because we're covering it quite a lot on other shows. But basically, what you're saying to me is, in common terms, you get heat. You get criticized in the United Kingdom and in the West if you try to put the Russian side of these things. I agree. Secondly, my opinion is that you can actually get persecuted in the West if you try to point out that Russia and Vladimir Putin have some reasons for the actions that they're taking. But the third big question is, do you get vilified for pointing out what is quite clearly a military truth, that Vladimir Putin is winning at whatever cost?
Yes, indeed, you do. I have said from the very first day of the Russian military campaign that the Russian military will win this war. Now that the Russian army is in Ukraine, nothing will eject it from there. This is the only opportunity that the Kremlin, the Russian people as a whole, have to ensure that Ukraine, or most of Ukraine, is brought back to Russia, and to at the same time ensure that Russia's southern frontier is safe. Because otherwise, if the Russian army was to, for example, stop in the Donbass and in Kherson and in Zaporozhye, then the day will come when the rest of Ukraine is admitted as a member to NATO. And that would mean catastrophe for Russian national security. And you're quite right, Lembit, that, for example, in Britain, British mainstream media is almost silent about the war in Ukraine. And there are a number of reasons for that, but they are not entirely silent. So now and again, you see preposterous, embarrassing articles and columns published by, for example, Bloomberg. Bloomberg recently ran a piece saying that in the month of December of 2025, 35,000 Russian soldiers were killed in action. Now, anyone who has even an ounce of understanding of warfare will realize that if 35,000 Russian soldiers died in 1 month, that would spell disaster along the entire front line in Russia, in Ukraine. Recently, the Financial Times said that Russian military losses are unsustainable. And who did they quote as a source? Ukrainian and European Union officials. But then the likes of Bloomberg and the Financial Times and BBC and Channel 4 News and so on, they have been saying from day one that the Russian army cannot sustain its losses in manpower and in hardware. Let us not forget, Lembit, that within a few weeks of the Russian military campaign in February of 2022, British mainstream media was saying that the Russian army is so short of equipment that it is taking parts from washing machines to repair tanks and other pieces of hardware. And at the same time, British mainstream journalists were saying that old age pensioners in Ukraine are shooting down Russian aircraft with hunting rifles, and Ukrainian wives standing on the balconies of their flats are bringing down Russian drones by throwing at them jars of tomatoes.
You can imagine a cartoon. It sounds like The Simpsons or something like that. Stay with us. I want to talk more about that in just a minute. You're watching me, Lembertopic, here on Unprecedented TV, Lembertopic Live with Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos, who's an international expert focusing on Russia and Eastern matters. The story so far that you're being told an awful lot of misinformation on the mainstream media, that Ukraine is not winning, cannot win, that the figures are wrong. I'm going to get into those war figures in a short while. But before we go further, I want to remind you of a great series, and that is Dire Consequences with Claire Dyer. She is an absolute trooper in her own right. Never fired a shot in anger, but is absolutely firing a shot across the bows of the establishment. What's this? Find that on the archive. Don't forget to like and subscribe at Unprecedented TV on YouTube. We're talking about the situation, the real situation in Ukraine. How many are dead on which side and who's winning? Still with me, Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos. Marcus, I want to get back to the figures you were talking about there. All kinds of different figures being bandied around. One of them is this one. If we can just get rid of the thing at the top there, that we can have a proper read of it. All kinds of figures, and it can get quite confusing. This one: 55,000 Ukrainian soldiers killed in war with Russia. Zelensky says that sounds like a phenomenal underestimate to me.
Lembit, I do not profess to know the exact figures as to how many Ukrainian soldiers have died and how many Russian soldiers have died. Suffice to say that 53,000 Ukrainian soldiers have not died in this war so far. Indeed, it is well in excess of that figure. It is a catastrophic number. I would put, by going by independent sources, independent journalists, independent military tacticians, going by their work and my own knowledge of how Russia conducts warfare, I would say that at a minimum 1.5 million Ukrainian soldiers have either been killed, wounded, lost in action, or taken prisoner. Indeed, I believe that figure is closing in on 2 million. One of the ways I can corroborate that is by saying this: why is it, even by Ukrainian officials conceding this and British officials conceding this, why is it that the age of the average Ukrainian serviceman on the front line is in his 40s. Why? Why?
What is the average age of a, sorry to interrupt, what's the average age of a Russian soldier? Do you happen to know?
Yeah, I would put that between the ages of the early 20s and late 20s.
No, okay, so let's look at another item here. Ukraine war briefing. Nearly 2 million military casualties to date. Study finds, with Russia bearing brunt of losses. Don't strike on Ukrainian passenger train, kills 5, and on it goes. But the point is, they're claiming most of those are Russian. Now, I think that's not true. And the point you've made is really interesting, the average age there, because you've got people of my age, you've got 60 and 65-year-olds on the Ukrainian side. They don't have a chance against perhaps the most battle-hardened army in the world.
There's no question about it that, as it currently stands, the Russian army is the most battle-hardened in the world. The Russian army is not only contending with NATO's Ukrainian army, but it is also contending by proxy with NATO itself. And in regard to Russian military losses, I would say, again, based on how I've calculated Ukrainian losses, I would say that the Russian military has probably incurred around 200,000 losses, which would include, of course, killed in action and wounded. But again, if the Russian military had sustained 1 million losses, 2 million losses, 3 million losses, as British and American mainstream journalists say, and of course, as Ukrainian officials allege, then the Russians would have to conscript a vast amount, far more than 300,000 or 400,000 that they do when it comes to the spring intake and the autumn intake. But there is another side to this. If Russia wants, it can call up 23 million soldiers.
23 million.
23 million soldiers.
Wow.
It can call up. The Russians don't need to do that, not for the war in Ukraine. The Russian military industrial complex, ever since 1947, when the Cold War began, the Russian military complex has been tasked with ensuring that the Russian military would be sustained in a war with America. That is why, amongst other things, Russia can call up 23 million soldiers. The Russians have over 26,000 tanks in its arsenal, and they are producing more as each week goes on. But of course, if they were incurring the losses that the West and the Ukrainian government alleges, then you would see far more soldiers, as I said, being called up, and the Russian military industrial complex would have to produce more tanks, more armored personnel carriers, more aircraft, and so on and so on. But they don't need to do that. And of course, some people would say, well, why is it, Dr. Marcus, that the Russian army is advancing so very slowly? Well, it's because that NATO has saturated Ukraine with military hardware, and at the same time, and this is not Russian propaganda, but the Kremlin and the Russian people as a whole do not wish to go out on an all-out blitzkrieg in Ukraine, because that would devastate the population there. That would devastate cities and towns there. That would devastate ancient Russian churches and monasteries, for example. So that is why they are steadily advancing. But also the Russian military has employed a strategy of death by 1,000 cuts. They don't need to advance rapidly. They don't need to carry out a blitzkrieg that NATO did, for example, against the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia in 1999, or as the Americans and the British did in Iraq in 2003, when they caused vast numbers of civilian casualties.
Let's look at the figures again. There's another statistic, and then I want to move on to the bigger picture. Times flying by, but I want to cover two other things. First of all, the ratio of deaths. This is one of the things I found. War in Ukraine, death ratio 36-1. Ukrainian to Russian deaths, about 1 million Ukrainian soldiers are dead. That's according to an American source. Other sources, like, for example, Colonel Douglas McGregor, controversial character, say the number is much higher, about 1.8 million dead Ukrainians. Europe has not seen such numbers since World War II. Now, that's the interesting thing. Every assessment I've seen puts orders of magnitude more dead Ukrainians in the frame than Brits. Warren Thornton is a regular contributor to our station. He says it's between 25 and 33-1. Now, you could say, oh, they're all getting propaganda from the same place. But those figures, can you just get that up again? Thank you. Those figures seem to suggest that the Ukrainians are losing hand over fist. 100 dead Ukrainians per dead Russian. It's still tragic for the Russian families, but it's 33 times worse, maybe 18 to minimum 18 times worse for the Ukrainians. And this seems to me unsustainable, because as far as I understand it, Marcus, all that Zelensky is achieving is more death and more loss of land. They either lose the land peacefully or they lose the land violently. Based on what I know, I'm not prepared to accept that nearly 2 million Ukrainian soldiers have died. I would say that close to 2 million Ukrainian soldiers have been killed in action, or wounded in action, or are missing in action, or have been taken prisoner. If you want me to say how many have been killed, I would say close to 1 million. This is not a war that NATO's Ukrainian army can win. They can never win this war. But the West, along with its puppet in Kiev, Zelensky, will continue the war going because it serves a number of purposes. They are trying to inflict a strategic defeat on the Russian army. They are trying to kill and wound as many Russian soldiers as possible in the hope that this will have dire consequences for the Russian economy, and in the hope that the Russian public will turn on the Russian government. Well, neither of those will ever happen. But they are also continuing the war because it serves as a distraction, or they hope that it will serve as a distraction from the war that the British state is carrying out against the British people, and the war that the European Union is conducting against the ancient nations of Europe. So that is why they are continuing this war. Yes, well, we're back to this situation here. Ukraine war later, Zelensky wants to risk US-Russia could strike bilateral deals in Ukraine without Kiev. And it seems to me that they would rather carry on the war than having some kind of a deal. The actual article in a different context goes on to talk about, it's a very recent article, if you're watching this live, about the risk of a deal by June. I don't see why that's a big risk, to be honest with you. I'd be rather pleased with that risk. But as you say, the coalition of the willing, that joke group supporting Ukraine, securing our future. You got a bunch there who don't know what they're doing. And they still seem to act like they're going to win. It does seem to me this is one massive, vast distraction. But worse than that, the fools on that platform don't seem to care about the death. Because if they did, they'd realize that all they're doing is sticking humans into a meat grinder and giving land away at the same time. The Western ruling elites and their useful puppets, such as Starmer, are soulless. They are devoid of empathy. They are devoid of human feelings. They are psychopathic killers. Just look at, for example, when they conducted war against the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia in 1999, they dropped depleted uranium on Serbian civilians, which inevitably caused a massive increase in cancer rates in Serbia, causing massive numbers of Serbian men, women, children, and elderly to die, and to die horrible deaths from cancer. So they care nothing for human life.
And the likes of Starmer and Macron and Merz, again, they have no power. They are merely puppets. If Starmer resigns, well, it won't be because he's taken that decision. It will mean that the British ruling elite have told him his time is up and he is to resign. But nothing will change in Britain because Starmer is merely a puppet. And whoever replaces him, for example, the moron Angela Rayner or whomever, will simply continue the same agenda. And I will very quickly say this, Lembit, that the Epstein files are merely the tip of the iceberg, which demonstrate the depraved nature of the British ruling elite and the American ruling elite and their friends and allies across the world.
So you reckon it's what's called in magic circles, it's called misdirection. You're saying even the Epstein files might be an aspect of misdirection, but I tend to agree with you, though. I really want to get to the heart of it because I think there's a huge amount of people being caught red-handed in those ruling elites by the Epstein thing, which is why it's so hard to drag the truth out of these people. But with Ukraine, you've got those people, once again, if you just have another look at those people so self-satisfied. And while they're doing this, you've got people grieving the deaths of their loved ones for no reason. I can't see any reason. I sound like a propagandist now, but I can't see any reason to pursue this because together with the loss of lives is the loss of land. Is there any scenario in which you think this is worth doing?
Regrettably, I do not believe a peaceful solution can be found to the war in Ukraine. I believe it will end on the battlefield and it will end in a Russian victory. You're not a propagandist for saying what you just said, Lembit. You just said what you said because you care for human life. You do not want husbands, sons, fathers, and uncles 6 feet under. But the British ruling elite, the American ruling elite, the European Union ruling elite do. They will sacrifice anything to achieve their geostrategic objectives. That is why they are some of the worst criminals in recorded history. And I don't say that lightly. I truly mean that. They are guilty of some of the worst crimes against humanity in recorded history. And I sincerely hope, Lembit, and I pray that the day will come when the British royal family and the British aristocracy and the media elites in Britain and the media barons in America and the rest of the American ruling elite and the NATO leadership are put before a court of law and are tried for crimes against humanity and are found guilty and are sent to a Victorian-style prison for the rest of their lives, because societies across the Western world, Lembit, would be a far better place without the presence of those malignant cancers in it.
Powerful words and a good place for us to end. I think you've actually opened up a whole new debate. Who are the elites? What are they doing? What's their goal? Let's not go into that now. I'll just finish with one other question, and it's a guess. On what date do you think the fighting will stop?
That is an impossible question for me, indeed for anyone else to answer. But I believe that at some point soon, relatively speaking, perhaps in the next year, you will see all of a sudden a breakthrough by the Russian army. And I believe that that will bring the war in Ukraine to an end. I believe that once the Russians are in control of most of Sumy and Kharkov, then the next part of their campaign will be Kiev. And Kiev, and I mean the city, not the oblast, the city of Kiev and the oblast will fall very quickly. Kiev is very close to the Belarusian border, very close to the Russian border. And of course, Belarus on paper is independent, but de facto, it's a part of the Russian Federation. The Russian military is present in Belarus. The Belarusian armed forces are de facto part of the Russian armed forces. And it wouldn't take much, Lembit, for the Russian military operating from Belarus and from Sumy to strike at Kiev. And I say Kiev, not Kiev, Kiev, because for over 1,000 years in the English language, the city, the mother of all Russian cities, was known as Kiev. It wouldn't take much for the Russian military to capture it when the day comes that they decide they are ready to do so.
Thank you so much. That's Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos. You have your say as well. You can do that on X at Lembidopic, or indeed at Unprecedented TV. Or best of all, please like and subscribe to our YouTube channel at Unprecedented TV. I'll finish with this thought. This war has been bloody. It's been messy. I believe you've been lied to about the numbers. I'm sure that Ukraine is losing orders of magnitude more people than the Russians. It stands to reason a conscript army against a professional one who's going to win. It's pretty obvious. And the land is being lost all the time. You're not hearing much about this on the mainstream because it's an inconvenient truth. Starmer and his misled 4th Division politician friends, in my view, from around Europe, have chosen a losing battle, and one in which they're not losing their lives. That's all, or mainly, down to mercenaries and Ukrainians. Unless we finish soon, hundreds of thousands more will die, and all to get the same outcome that we can get by doing a deal now. I would suggest, Volodymyr Zelensky, you know the outcome. Are you going to do it the easy way or the meat grinder way? And if so, you'll get to the same place. But are you going to kill 500,000 Ukrainians and thousands more Russians in the process? I know my answer. I'll leave you, the viewer, to choose yours. I'm Lembidopic. This was Lembidopic Live on Unprecedented TV.
Immediate ceasefire in Gaza, the return of the sausages.